digitaljamsessions.com.
Hi, producer Tony here, and welcome to this week's Digital Jam Session. This week we're joined by Samantha Wolf, branding and marketing executive and founder of Pitch Forward, also the co-author of Marketing New Realities. Returning is Phil Harris, writer, developer and designer at Big Point Studios. Making her debut is Bree Scalaro. She works sharing innovative approaches using VR for mental health treatment and is the founder of the consulting firm Scalaro and Associates. And also returning is Oscar Clark. He's the executive producer at Rocket Lolly Games. Now over to Tanya and enjoy the show.
digitaljamsessions.com.
Well, thank you all for joining us today, and we decided that we're going to have a rather big conversation in a small amount of time. Because you know me, I love to pick these really big, broad topics. And I felt that given the wonderful mix of people that we had in this conversation, I was really interested to explore this idea of the evolution of self, the evolution of identity, and how people are perceiving identity and that shift in identity, because I think it's something that is being constantly challenged by things like VR and things like social media, where the idea of oneself and how one communicates and articulates that self to the world around them is constantly evolving and constantly changing. And I wanted to try and dig into that a little bit deeper, given that we have some experts across a whole variety of different fields here. And so I'm going to start with you, Oscar, just because one of the words that I personally hate, I can't stand this word, but everybody uses this word, especially those people from outside of the games industry, when they talk about gamification. And the reality of the situation, no pun intended, is that there are a great many corporations who are utilizing elements of game design to drive behaviors and to influence behaviors. And they're putting a title on that, a tag on that, of gamification. And it interests me because one of the key things that many people don't seem to realize about what we do in the games industry most of the time is that we are engineering behavioral change. And so, Oscar, I'm curious from your perspective when it comes to this borrowing of techniques that have been around in the games industry for at least 30 odd years now, what your sentiment is in terms of how these are being articulated and translated into these other mediums, be that social media, be that virtual reality, or be that any other new and emerging technology.
Yeah, I think it's a phrase that people love to hate, and I can't always quite place myself on it. I think it's worth separating out a couple of things. So what we're doing in games a lot of the time is trying to find the seamless way to encourage people to find a way to resolve a problem we've created for them, because there's an inherent pleasure in the satisfaction of completing a puzzle. And so a lot of what we do in games is about that kind of model. Then there's also the other sort of angle, which I think, you're kind of hinting at, this social engineering mindset, the idea of driving people to particular behaviors and rewarding them. The trouble is, a lot of that is based on some really not bad, but old and outdated views about operant conditioning, about kind of, forcing people's behavior. What's fascinating is that, we're constantly bombarded with ways of what good looks like, what socially acceptable is, what social capital looks like, why doing something will make other people look well at us, how we can aspire to things. So there's nothing new under the sun here, but the technique of learning from what games do in order to be able to drive a narrative. So if you think about a magic moment in a game, I'm running from zombies and I choose to turn left, not right at the end of a corridor. And only later when I go back do I realize there was never a real right turn. But I didn't notice it because the way the lighting worked, the way the music worked, the way the zombies were chasing me, all of this kind of elements have been thought through by the designer to create both an architectural and a UI and a UX. All the elements are designed to make me feel like I chose that direction when actually it was laid out for me. So the fact that we have to do this in games because, frankly, we can't build every aspect of the world. It would get very boring if you went down the wrong corridor. There's lots of things that we've had to learn in order to shortcut people's mental responses to things. But it just frustrates me when we look at it and think about it in manipulation, because we can't really manipulate people, but we can lay out the groundwork for them to make the right choice, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And so the fact that corporations are then taking that on board and trying to apply that to websites or processes is mostly a good thing.
Mostly a good thing. But I do fear that there are perhaps a lot of companies that jump in very deep into this stuff and don't necessarily fully understand what it is they're getting themselves into.
Well, they expect to do magic as well. It's not necessarily magic. It's just what's a good way to make something work.
Well, I'm okay. So I'm going to throw this one at you, Brie, because from a kind of a mental health perspective, a psychological perspective, one of the things I find quite interesting here is this idea of creating, as kind of Oscar alluded to, this idea of creating that need or creating that high of success that becomes a need for people to constantly have that hit of success, if that makes sense, to have that excitement, that kind of endorphin release of succeeding or failing, whatever the thing may be, that gives them that sense that I need to come back to this game, I need to come back to this experience in order to get that same endorphin release. Now, a really good example of how this type of thinking, this type of behavioral thinking has been applied to something that is not necessarily a game as such, but is most definitely utilizing some of those behaviors, is when we see, for example, the little red circle. The way that the little red circle on a smartphone, when you, especially any iPhone user knows what I'm talking about, when you have a little red circle next to any app, it's like you cannot last for long. It's like the countdown has begun. The minute you see that little red circle, you're gonna give in and you're gonna eventually click on that app icon so that you can get rid of that little red circle. And it's a behavior that's been cultivated and is deliberately driven to push people to specific behaviors in order to get them to feel pleasure about the fact that little red circle has vanished once they've checked their emails or once they've double checked how many messages have come in or whatever the thing is. And I'm curious, Brie, from your perspective, whether or not you feel that perhaps there is too much in the way of engineering that is being applied to these mass networks, whether it's social media or whether it is something like using a smartphone or whatever the thing is, that these things are perhaps being imbued with this almost certain degree of addiction in everything that we do.
Yeah, Tanya, that's a really good point. And something that came immediately to mind is this aspect of addiction, right? And I don't know too much about the gaming or the movie world in VR, but we need to remember to focus on creating good content that psychologically and physiologically relates to the viewer versus just creating cool ways or this gamification of things to keep us going. Right now in the mental health community, we have a growing rate of the internet, gaming, and addiction. And yes, we're making the reward center in the brain fire like crazy, when really we could use this opportunity to, increase someone's interest and motivation in the actual content or experience itself. Something that we use in virtual reality for therapies is we like software that allows the therapist to actually control different aspects of the virtual environment. So we don't allow a patient to just explore a virtual environment and sort of level up or get rewards or badges for doing something good. The therapist is in control of that. If you're in a fear of driving, we can put you in the backseat. We can make it rainy as heck outside. We can make traffic for days. And the most powerful aspect of all of this is that physiological response that we're getting out of patients. So something that I really hope to see more in virtual reality or even augmented reality is the incorporation of biofeedback and physiological measures, measuring someone's heart rate, skin response, respiration pattern, and allowing the virtual environment to change or mold as such. I think that's going to create a very powerful psychological experience that I know a lot of, at least therapy apps are, and maybe some beginning in the gaming community.
It's interesting that you should say this, because this is actually one of the reasons why I decided to talk about this particular topic, is because very, very recently I saw something. Phil, I'm going to throw this at you because you understand where I'm going to come from on this, which is I saw a game that shall remain unnamed that is announcing all over the various media outlets that they are about to launch a new VR game. And their pure spin, is that they are going to be hooking up their players to a heart monitor so that they know when you are most scared, and they can add in more scares to make you even more frightened because it's a VR horror game. To which I felt like, I wonder who thought this was a good idea to literally try and give your player a heart attack. I'm not sure that I want to play a game where somebody is actively monitoring my heart rate in order to try and freak me out even more than I already am. Personally, I think this is a really poor example of the application of technology for technology's sake. You know, it's like somebody's just throwing in that heart rate monitor because they can, not because they necessarily should. And is it really a morally good thing to do to try and freak somebody out to the point of literally scaring them to death? Phil, the floor is yours, young man. How do you feel about this one?
Well, yes, it's a terrible example. It comes back. It's the old psychological experiment where you have one person in one room who's applying a shock to the person in the other room, and they have no real idea about what the shocks are going to do, about what the volts and what the amps, what they actually do, and the other person in the other room screaming falsely that they're not actually being electrocuted. It's just how far will people go? Except now you're automating that system, so there's no actual control there. There's just a lack of control there. And yes, there's the risk. I mean, how many times, I know there's a privacy issue here, which I'll just come back to, but I know that there's this need I have when I'm in the internet that I just don't give a lot of my information away when I'm like working on an external app. There's lots of reasons for doing that. Also, as a narrative, I have to clear my cache so many times so that the hits and the searches aren't coming back in a way that's meant to suit me, which doesn't suit me at all. And so, you know, if something says, "Oh, do you have a heart condition?" I'm more likely to say, "Well, no," because it's not really going to matter, and then have the heart attack later and then like sue the company, rather than actually admit that that problem's there. And the privacy thing is this thing throughout all social media. I think social media is slowly, and VR, potentially if it links to social media, will slowly chip away at our privacy. It has been chipping away at our privacy for a long, long time now. We all have our sort of like public image. It's like Videodrome, which is a 1980s like Cronenberg film, if nobody knows. It's like this thing where you have the fear. And having worked in mental health for 5 years as a welfare rights advisor and sort of fought cases at tribunal and things like this, it's really, really essential that I see these people using social media as well, and they cannot cope with the social media. And so if you start putting things like that into games, which are a more popular medium in some ways, then I don't know if they'll know when to say stop and when they'll know when to back out. And that's a significant problem, because it is this sort of Candyman thing where we just keep giving candy to the baby and the baby just keeps taking the candy, but it's getting too much, and we need to like back down. And talking about what everybody else has talked about is just like and find different ways to emphasize this thing. It's a bit like VR, where people say, "Oh, this is a completely new medium," and it's like, no, goddamn, this is what I talked to you about in one of our previous podcasts. You know, if you want to see what VR is, if you want to see how you can like picture the world in VR and the possibilities there, then you need to go back to the basics. You need to sort of look at Greek theatre and theatre in the round. You need to look at a library or a museum and how that's laid out and how that is sensitive to the person and how that makes them feel. So, I think it's a terrible example to try and like increase the scares with people. I think there's far, far better ways to do that, which don't depend on like somebody's heart rate or what's happening with them at the moment.
Okay, so Sam, I'm kind of curious from your perspective then, given where Phil is kind of at with this whole idea of personal information and the use of that personal information being used to adapt individual experiences. I think one of the interesting things here when we talk about that difference between, for example, VR from a gaming or even a healthcare perspective versus 360 film, which are very different formats, let's be very clear about that. And right now in 360 film, there isn't necessarily a reason why you would personalize the experience with enhancements around personal data or biological or biometric data for that matter. But that it doesn't mean that people haven't been thinking about it. And certainly I know that in previous conversations with Kathy and yourself, we've spoken about biometric marketing, for example. And I'm curious where you see that line being drawn in terms of not just the acquiring of the information, but the application of that information and that data being utilized to drive the person's emotional and physical state. Do you think this is something that we'll begin to see more of as we see more and more of these deals that are emerging with major studios like NBC Universal has made a deal with Google for their VR content, and we're seeing all of these movies and all of these TV shows now committing to having 360 content as a standard part of their content mix. Do you see this being something that potentially is going to start emerging further down the line?
I actually think of it as not even just 360 video, but what, the experience of the individual for 360 video VR or even augmented reality. We're about to get so much data available that people don't even necessarily know what to do with it. And when it comes to the TV networks and film studios diving into it, I'm all for it. I mean, honestly, I want the industry to grow. And I do think of it as not that, as was just mentioned, that VR isn't entirely new. It might be a new platform, but it's still, you still use, at least for me, as a marketer and brand manager, you still use the same kind of tools to get people interested in it. And you still use generally the same kind of creative brief in order to develop it. Now, in terms of how much you give away, I mean, this is just like such a deep philosophical conversation. I mean, in light of everything that's happened with Facebook and with everything with social media, I mean, I think it becomes an individual choice. I mean, I think it's easier in some ways to, get the advertisement that you want to see as opposed to something that's completely irrelevant to you, but it ends up being it's almost like that uncanny valley thing. But when it comes to advertising, it's like if it's too specific, then you start getting freaked out. If it's generally probably something you'd be interested in, then you don't necessarily worry about it because it actually is saving you a little bit of time. The one thing that, I mean, you started off talking about the idea of self within VR, and I just want to talk. Is it okay, Tanya, if I just sort of relay one personal experience?
By all means, do share.
Okay. See, when I started in VR, because I'm used to television, I'm used to video. I love video of any form. And the one thing when I tried, and I think it was a 360 video, and then I tried VR after that, I realized that it is such a question of self when you put it on, especially if the person who's creating the creator has not given you a body, so that you're just sort of floating in midair, and you're still experiencing the experience, whatever it might be, whether it be sort of a narrative piece or something that's a little bit more interactive, even if it's just sort of tracking where you're looking. And so when I did it for the first time, it became a very existential kind of experience, because it's like, who am I? If I can't look at my arms and see my arms move and see my legs move, who am I really in this place? And so I do think that VR and AR is tied to the self, even in that sort of literal form, like, what is your arms? What are your legs? Even if you're going to be a avatar of some sort, you end up questioning sort of who am I? Not only sort of who am I within this space, but I guess sort of circling back to what you said, but what am I willing to show to other people, whether it be from a data standpoint or from a physical standpoint?
I find this quite interesting because you're talking about what degree of information, and we've thrown the whole Facebook thing into the arena here. So
sorry,
I'm going to go down this. No, it's all good. I'm going to go down this road here. I'm going to ask a question that I think is kind of relevant for our times, which is that I think there are several different schools of thought around this, but I find it quite interesting because you have some people who are very clued up They are very politically aware. They are very technologically savvy. They understand what they're getting themselves into and what it means to have an exchange of information. And they understand how to a certain extent, protect their data. And then you have the other types of people who aren't necessarily technology savvy, don't necessarily understand what it means to protect their data, and are easily scared by the media hype and the fright stories that people put out there about your data and your information has all been shared and it's all going to come back and damage you or whatever the thing may be. And there is often a lack of cultural awareness when we get to a point where literally we as society, when it comes to privacy and data at least, we're in the pot. We are the lobster, and the water has been brought up to a nice simmer and it's going up to the boil. And because we've been in that pot, we haven't really noticed, if that makes any kind of sense to anybody at all.
Can I throw in a little bit of a dissenting voice as well?
By all means.
So there's a couple of things that we've talked about. We mentioned addiction as a phrase.
Yes.
Which is very topical because there are a bunch of psychologists who are trying to get the World Health Organization, to include games addiction directly as a... However, it is being very strongly challenged. And a lot of psychologists I know are actually very angry about it because they don't think it's based on good science. And the reason being that, there is I believe it, but I'm going by my friends who are psychologists, that there is a stark difference in terms of how a behavioural addiction works and how a physiological addiction works. Now, I'm not going to get into the detail of that because it's not my expertise, but I know that's being challenged. So I think we should be a bit careful about that kind of sort of way of looking at it. But equally, the data part of the question also similarly raises a whole bunch of responsibilities. Data's really good in so many different ways. It's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly empowering, and used wisely and sensibly and honestly and authentically is a good. Now, there are obviously clearly with things like Cambridge Analytica, examples of where it has been misused, where communication of its value, what it's being collected, and all this other stuff, has been kind of really, damagingly misused, so much so that we're losing, understandably losing a lot of trust, and maybe that trust wasn't well placed anyway. Again, similarly, the idea that you can have a heart rate monitor to see how people respond and change the gameplay. Now, obviously, the reactions that you guys had to that was, this is terrible, it's an invasion, it's awful, and it's going to cause people to have a heart attack. Whereas my reaction is, hey, hang on a minute. This is an incredibly interesting thing, and I've seen people use cameras to observe people's facial behavior to change moments inside gameplay, and it really enhanced the experience. Now, again, comes down to how do we get confidence that the people using these tools are authentic, are using it in a transparent way, they're communicating well, and they're not doing it in a way that's exploitative or damaging to the individuals concerned.
Therein lies the question, Phil, which is that when it comes to that particular game studio, and please, if you're listening to this and you're from the particular game studio in question, and you ought to know who you are, if you are in that studio, please do contact me and let me know the truth of this, because I am curious. Who in that studio has the moral and ethical obligation to ensure that this data is being utilized in a way that does not cross the line? Who draws the line first in the first place, and who is monitoring within the company that the company is never going to step over that line? Because what I find to be quite interesting is when we work generalistically in the startup industries, whether that is gaming or not, there are very few moral and ethical guardians who are making sure that what people are doing is necessarily right and proper for the mainstream consuming public. Oftentimes, these startups are, 10, even 15 years ahead of the curve in the decisions that they are making, in the way that UX, that UI, that technology, that hardware, whatever the thing may be, is going to be utilized. And the public, the mainstream consuming public, who are not tech savvy, or even if they were tech savvy, do not have a say in how these things turn out. Instead, they will just be fed that technology, that software, that hardware, that experience when it comes to market. without having had any input into whether or not it is right and proper to necessarily choose that path. And I'm curious, from your perspective, Brie, when you look at this as somebody who isn't within the entertainment kind of sphere, as everybody else in this conversation is, where you see that moral and ethical boundary standing when it comes to the utilization of data or the design and architecture of experiences, who should have that moral obligation, that ethical obligation?
I think that from an outsider perspective in mental health, we're held to very high standards around how we handle patient or client's personal information. We have specific HIPAA privacy laws that dictate sort of the safeguards that we need to take in order to make sure that all personal identifying information from a patient's experience is not accessible. This gets very blurred in this day and age where data is stored on clouds and goes through, technological advances that I have no ability to speak on, but there has to be some sort of board or something that's regulating dictating how we're going to be using this information. I don't know if there already is, but I think it does come down to that specific software agency as well as who they're outsourcing to that data to, where it's being stored on the cloud. I mean, again, in mental health, this is very clear cut for me, but it's almost like the mental health is more of a closed loop versus the hundreds of thousands of individuals that their data and their user experience, their legitimate physiological state are now going to be held in databases online. And I can't even begin to think about how that data will be used to further, inform marketing or whatever that might be.
Interesting. So, Oscar, from your perspective, having obviously been involved with many studios in your career, do you feel that there are enough studios who are thinking about the nature of the data that they hold and whether or not...
there's a legal framework. There is a legal framework. It exists right now.
I'm aware that there's a legal framework, but sorry, Oscar, I was just going to kind of say, what I was going to ask was, do you think there are enough studios who are thinking about the nature of the data they hold and its comparisons or its similarities to electronic health records and how that data should be treated?
I don't think that many people are thinking about it in those comparisons because we're kind of prohibited from doing that anyway. And what's interesting is the new GPDR. Now, I don't particularly have an issue with the GPDR regulations. They are a lot stricter. They do feel a little bit like, I don't know how many of you have experienced European cookie legislation.
Yeah.
It feels like somebody who doesn't know technology trying to put a technology solution to something. I mean, that's maybe a little unfair of me, but I mean, the general principles are quite sound. We want to make sure that, if you're going to have trackable data, that you know what it's for, that you are able to get it and you're able to have it expunged. I think that's not unreasonable. And I think, from there, the ethical kind of considerations around that are essentially not solved, but they're at least contained. Our responsibility is to tell people what we're using their data for and be clear and transparent about that. We have a moral responsibility to do that in an authentic way. But there's also a functional benefit. We are trying to make, in our case, in this entertainment space, we are trying to make commercially successful and enjoyable experiences. If we act inappropriately, that will damage our brand, probably irrevocably. I don't think there are many game studios that could survive the year that Facebook's had. And as somebody who's worked in, for example, when I was working on PlayStation Home, these kind of things were absolutely part of our daily conversation, maybe not daily, but regular conversation, which is the focus was, how do we get the right balance of the information that we can get so that we can make the game better? And the intention was always about the utility for the players. And I think it's a lot easier for game studios if they do focus on the value for play for those players, and that is their driving motive. The likelihood is they should avoid many of the potential dangers, and the ones that they could fall into, hopefully the legislation, and I believe generally it does, prohibits you from falling into those unfortunate Dunning-Kruger moments where you don't know how bad it is because you don't understand it.
Yes.
If you get my drift.
Yes, absolutely. I do think it is quite an interesting conversation, just in as much as I don't think there are enough of the smaller studios who have this conversation. I think when you're working for the larger organizations like a Big Point or a PlayStation, that those kind of conversations are inherently part of your process, because you are big enough to be thinking about it and you have a legal team who are going to be thinking about it. But I do think that when you're talking about indie, whether that's indie game makers or indie filmmakers, may not necessarily be on the top of their priority list.
Although if you've ever visited a maze or an event like that, which is an amazing indie thing, essentially the amount of conversations about ethics and morals that we have about game development, some which I would argue are actually morals. But it's almost, student college kind of level conversations in some ways. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in there's a vibrant passion to do the right thing. I think a lot of, like any artist in any culture, that is the really powerful thing about working in games, is that there's a lot of people out there who just want to make amazing art with their gameplay that entices people in and does the right thing.
I fully agree with you. But I am curious, from everybody's perspective on this conversation, what it is that you think is that one thing that needs to shift, be that a cultural thing or a technological thing, that is going to change the way that people look at identity in this era of social media and virtual reality and digital identity versus physical identity. But what is that one thing that you think will really change or be some kind of a key change moment where people really do begin to see identity as something that has tangible commercial value that they need to protect and nurture and be more aware and more responsible around their own digital identity? And I'm going to start with you, Samantha.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of discussion about identity in general when people are talking about their public persona and their private persona, and how people have, pushed a certain perception of who they are on social media, whether it be Instagram or Facebook, which I've heard be called fake book. It's sort of like, this is what I want people to see. I think that there only recently has it been sort of diving into the metadata of it all, that it's not just about the photos, but it's also about all the other information and the things sort of under the surface that are happening, and what do you want people to know. It's good for me to know about the gaming industry being so aware of sort of the moral impact of what they're doing, or at least discussing it. I feel like there was definitely some discussion of that within the TV industry, and I haven't found as much of it within, VR from a sort of broadly narrative. I mean, I think people are just
I would
trying
agree
to
with
expand.
that. Mm-hmm.
They're trying to expand what's possible.
They're busy experimenting and kind of kicking the tires.
And I mean, Kathy and I put a section in the book about thinking about the effects of VR, and obviously if it's, if you have Bree and a lot of people working on using VR for good for mental health, there are going to be people who are going to want to use VR for not so good, because it does. I mean, you remember it like memories. You can use it in not so great ways. And so having some kind of rule or regulation or standards that apply to all, that it would allow a certain amount of maybe it's going to take a court case. I don't know. That's going to say, somebody's going to do it for bad. And then everybody's going to realize, wait a second, everybody needs to follow a standard in order to make sure that people maintain it.
Okay. So establishing some standards is where Sam's at. Phil, where are you at with this?
I have to agree with something that Oscar said. I think, I was devil's advocating a little, but I also think that anything attached to the heartbeat is slightly more dangerous, like medically, from what I've learned in the past. Maybe attached to breathing. I think the facial recognition thing is really, really good. I think this argument happened quite a lot when Second Life was out, and can people have as perceived sexual relations with somebody else in Second Life and still have a normal sexual relationship with their partner back at home and things like this. And Second Life was quite open. In fact, the industry part of Second Life, the advertising and marketing part, were things around the center of like the actual experience. And I think as long as in a lot of ways, one of the benefits of the internet, but it's also one of its major curses, is that it's quite anarchic in its own way, that anything can go and anything can be there. And I think in a community way, as these experiences become larger and more encompassing, the communities will just move to the right spots to be happy with people who are of their identity there, and will literally shove up people out of that community if they feel that that person is acting out with the benefits of the community. And I also think that, you know, both games and other experiences like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, which dealt with psychosis, when the games company spends the time to learn about the problems that they're trying to address or the things that they're trying to say, then you can say some amazing things. And again, to just ape Oscar, in game jams and things like this, ethics are always a discussion topic. I've dealt with quite a lot of teams because I do quite a lot of mentoring at game jams. People like come to me and discuss subjects like depression or anxiety and things like this because they wanted to address this in their game. And you know, and we've looked at that together and what they can express in the game. But then I've always said, and then go to the bodies who deal with that within the UK or the US or wherever you are, and talk to them about it and find out if they're really interested in taking this product forward. Because I think there's a lot of good, worthy products out there and projects. And sometimes, again, as like Oscar was saying, if you take it outside the process that's going on, if you take it, if it just becomes an element of play, and I think play is absolutely essential to all humankind. It becomes an element of play, and so you're not forcing it down people's throats. Then I think those identities will like free up, and the personal identity and the online identity may actually become a little bit more disparate again, which I think would probably only be a good thing.
Okay, so there's a couple of things that you raised there that I thought were really interesting, and I just want to comment on them. First of all, I fully agree. Game jams, people do often stop and have the conversation around morals and ethics and whether or not what they're doing is necessarily something they should do. I actually find it interesting because by comparison, going to a pure tech hackathon, that question is often less asked than at a game jam, which says a lot, I think, for the games industry in general, that we do think to ask these things. The other thing that I just had a flash in my head for a moment there, where he was talking about the future of kind of relationships as such, and well, the past, if you like, in terms of Second Life and the way that people were having, you know, I say affairs in inverted commas with people who were digital versus their real life partner. And, you know, it does lead to this whole other interesting aspect of conversation where, you know, it's almost like the Demolition Man moment where, you know, Sandra Bullock is saying, do you want to have intercourse? And Sylvester Stallone is, yeah, sure, I'm up for that. And she sticks a helmet on his head, and there's no touching involved, because that's where they've evolved to in terms of their social acceptance of what it means to have intercourse with somebody is not a physical activity anymore. And I kind of find it interesting in as much as if we look at where we are culturally, nowadays more people meet with dating websites and dating apps and whatever the digital form of you know, thing is that throws these people together, because people aren't engaging in the same way as they used to, and they're not finding those ways to engage with each other because of people's lifestyles and how busy they are and all of these other things. But there was a time back in the 90s, and I'm sure Oscar and Phil, you both know where I'm coming from with this, but you know, back in the early days of the internet, you know, in the early 90s there, you were a bit of a weirdo if you sat in a chat room and spoke with a bunch of other people. Now it is totally normal to send texts and have an entire relationship long distance with somebody via text messages. And that's an interesting
What do you mean
shift.
90s? I remember 1984 with my dial-up modem, you know, and yeah. I mean, seriously, I know people who got married as a result of meeting each other in the earliest days on bulletin boards, let alone when,
Yes.
you know, I think the biggest change for me was watching the number of people I know who got divorced over World of Warcraft only to marry somebody in their guild.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the thing is, we always cast this as a negative. it actually is an incredibly empowering thing. Without these sort of these tools, people found it very difficult to find people outside of their cultural sphere.
Mm-hmm.
It was very, and don't get me wrong, the internet is its own echo chamber too. But what I think I've learned is, having literally had a modem, some online connection since 1984, it's fascinating to me how we are still evolving to know where connectivity fits into our routines. We haven't worked out what social etiquette should be properly, hence why we have trolls. But the thing that always gives me joy is when I think about, I'm going to take a moment out of the Batman VR game, when you're playing the young Bruce Wayne watching his parents getting killed. Now, to get the story, everybody knows the story of Batman, but you feel small, you feel powerless, you feel incredibly different from who you are. You have a better way to understand what it feels like to be Bruce Wayne than any other medium has ever been able to deliver. And as a metaphor for what we can do with these technologies, the idea that we can actually allow you to see what it is like to not necessarily be the cis white man that I am. It allows me to think about things in ways where I can understand, maybe not understand, that's too strong a word, but at least get a sense of what it must be like for my trans son. I can understand things in ways I could not have done before. The trick is, though, building those things and getting them distributed in ways where it's easy. People shouldn't be having to chase and making sure they're protecting their ID. They should be able to assume that their identity is protected. And there will need to be, probably more court cases, more behaviours, more learning, because we're in the earliest days. The games industry is 30 years old. The movie industry is 100 years old. We are so in the early days.
This is very, very true. Bree, do you have some thoughts on this big question?
When I think about virtual reality, mental health, and identity, I just can't help but to think about that virtual reality allows us to bring power back into someone's self, allows us to enhance someone's identity, or to acknowledge parts of it that might not be working for them in a daily life, and to bring in new positive changes. Virtuality and mental health, it allows us to repair the identity and dive into yourself in a way that is, to me, less threatening than a lot of people feel like mental health is. And whether that's, the thing in the news lately is using virtual reality to help individuals with varying degrees of dementia, bringing memories back, or even if we use virtual reality to address gender bias or other isms. We know that we're in virtual reality, and we should allow patients to maintain a grounded understanding of where they are in space and time, where we can allow them to safely explore different parts of their identities, or at least challenge parts of themselves that may not be working for them in a daily life.
Awesome. Okay. Well, as always, we like to give our listeners a way to be able to find out a little bit more about you. We ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. What would that be, Sam?
My social media of choice as Samantha G. Wolfe, WOLFE, on Twitter. And there's also the VR/AR/MR, sorry, so many letters, marketing and branding group on Facebook.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. Phil, what would be the social media handle of choice?
You can find me on Twitter at Philip G. Harris, all one word, Philip with one L.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Bree?
Hi, yes, you can find me on Twitter at handle _BScolaro. That's BSCOLARO.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Oscar?
And you can find me everywhere. I tend to use the handle Athanasius, which is ATHANATEUS.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you, and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk.
digitaljamsessions.com